questions that was raised this morning during our panel session was actually about how we track the programs and interventions that we're using around leadership development, specifically we were talking about there. But our next session is looking at how we create a holistic ecosystem for our learning and development, how we can put that in, how we can understand whether it's being effective or not. So I'm going to hand you straight over to Stuart Page from Net Dimensions. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much. Hi all, hi. If you want to stand up and shout at me in Italian, do so, I don't mind, but I won't ask you to do anything like that. So this session was future-proof your learning ecosystem, but I have put "and considerations for starting" as a sort of side caption, because in a sense everyone's going to be at different stages in understanding what on earth an ecosystem is, and actually people are going to be looking at this in different ways. So a learned person or people have said to me that the typical LMS is no longer the centre of corporate learning, and it's becoming less relevant. So I'm Stuart Page, and I've recently joined a company to promote learning management systems. And you might think that's a little foolish, but actually I'm going to stand here and talk about how that's quite the contrary, and show you why that is. So before we start, just a raise of hands on who knows what a learning ecosystem is. Ah, great. So I won't ask any questions, but I was got one person. That's great. My next question may not be relevant then. Have you had involvement in implementing components of an ecosystem?
Based upon our conversation, yeah, absolutely.
Good, excellent. Okay. So I'm going to hopefully provide you a bit more detail on this. I'll hopefully give you at least one piece of information, useful information that you can take back with you, perhaps more based on the hands or lack of hands. And I think what's really important is that, as through my discussions with people here already, people are at different stages. Things ebb and flow. We go from having a joined up ERP system with a learning module to a best-of-breed LMS, and then we flip-flop back. So in a sense, what I'm going to put to you is a bit more meat around the bones on what an ecosystem is and how it might fit where you are now, or at least take some ideas away on how it might fit you. So a learning ecosystem, in a sense, is a very broad thing. It can cover the culture of the organisation, in some cases the funding of learning. When we work with companies who are providing their own training content, they might have a way of needing to ensure that there's funding there for the training they're deploying. I'm going to focus more on the data infrastructure of learning today, ecosystem. So my definition is this, which is a combination of technologies and support services, resources available to help individuals learn. And why I'm happy about where I am when I say I'm now in a world of learning and LMS is that my company, Net Dimensions, has recently been brought into its own ecosystem. And it gives me a nice segue to explain that ecosystem and explain how those companies are connected, because in a sense, that mirrors the way potentially you should look at how you should engage different learning providers without a concern that everything needs to be in one box and all be wrapped up nicely, which is never the case in real world. And in the diagram here, you'll see Net Dimensions in the center, but I'm just going to take you through my ecosystem and explain how that connects. And it may have similarities with some of the stuff you're doing. Please say Net Dimensions joined a company called Learning Technologies Group recently, within a year or so. And Net Dimensions is a learning management system. We focus more on highly regulated industries, mainly because we've got very deep functionality in managing complex operational and compliance requirements. But that in isolation is great in one sense, but the nice thing about being in a larger group now is that I'm joined by some other great products. And the nice thing is that, much like your ecosystem, you want the right supplier to give you the best of what they can do, not give you one strong element and they try to do the rest to broaden out their offering and hopefully entice you to buy substandard functionality. So for me, we are best of breed LMS. We are focusing on what we focus on. But now I'm in a group where we have a content authoring tool, Gomo Learning. So a great new content authoring tool built from the ground up. It focuses very much on ensuring that it's suitable for any device that's there. It's fully mobile responsive. Hey, it may not have the extent of some of the bigger, more established players, but it's certainly starting off on the right way, and it's got a great roadmap. But it's starting off considering a mobile-ready audience from the outset because it's a new company. The great thing for me is that as part of my ecosystem, we've got a direct connector, single-click connector through from their content authoring tool into our LMS. So already we're letting them do what they specialize in, and we're letting us do what we're good at, but actually there's a connector between the two. We work then with content provider, Leo Learning, well-established, well-regarded content provider, does a lot of bespoke blended learning, used to be Epic, now Leo, been around for a couple of decades, and they really focus on ensuring that the content that they develop measures the capability and the competence of the employees that it's being served to, and more so, and a little bit about what I'll talk about later, they focus on how we can start to correlate learning and the investment in learning with performance of the business, which is really a critical thing for investing more money in. We have a learning analytics company, Watershed, and towards the latter part of what I'm talking about, I'll be talking more about learning record stores and the idea of using an analytics platform to bring together multiple sources of information to really start to measure how your learning is being how it's being delivered and how it's being interacted with different parties. We have Uclea. Uclea are, again, specialists in what they do, governance, risk, and compliance training. And what's interesting about, when I would to review the audience and the delegates at this event, is that in some shape or form, many of you have potentially been involved with some of these organisations. And the nice thing for me now is that not only can I have a broader discussion with people like yourself, but I'm not there just simply to promote something which isn't necessarily right from your timing perspective. It might be that on your journey you've got an LMS and you're sorted for the next 3 years, but actually you need help with something else. So these elements are quite critical to us as a group. We have Russell C. Software also. They're the experts in the e-learning standards, based out of the US, SCORM and TINCAN, and XAPI. And XAPI is something I'm going to try and demystify a bit later on in trying to translate what that means and how it could actually work for you, because there's a lot of buzzwords out in the industry, as you know, and sometimes they're not always that well described. And I guess the cool kids on the block for us are Preloaded. They're a London-based game studio. They do a lot of virtual reality. They've got a Tate Modern VR experience for one of the artists at the moment. So they are really very forward-thinking on the VR and the augmented reality, and they've got some apps for BBC Earth and that type of thing. So we've got, I guess, a lot of innovation going on in parts of the business, which can then also start to feed into other parts that we're doing. I'm sure you as a learning audience know this, but the Phos group as an organisation is a great place to get objective advice. Just log in there, sign up, and you'll get a lot of interesting research and surveys that they do. And I'm just pleased to say, whilst I'm on that, the LTG, Learning Technology Group, have been put in a very strong position in that box, because it's really aiming to be the best of learning in all capability in different areas. And by focusing on learning, we're doing what we're good at, which is what we promote. Net Dimensions, we are a compliance LMS predominantly because of the deep-seated functionality that we have, and we've got great clients in high-consequence industries, and pleased to say for the second year we've won that. So my ecosystem analogy has helped me at least do a shameless plug of the company, which is a good start for me. Let's talk a bit about what you're doing in terms of your learning. And this is another research that occurred last year. Phos were looking at the types of learning technologies that are being used by different organisations. So I don't know if you can see that, but what we've got is some content and platforms which are mainstream, and you can see there that 65% of organisations, I think there are about 1,000 L&D professionals that were researched on this, are undertaking what they might call mainstream content. With regards to emerging, if you can see the content there, like mobile, user-generated gamification, maybe a raise of hands. How many of you are engaging with, in your actual, not just exploring it, but actually engaging with that type of content with your learners now? Okay, so it's not far off there. Yeah, well, it's 30, it's a broad percentage there, but 35 to 65%. And what about the exploring, the MOOCs and the serious games and virtual reality? Has anyone really gone into that? Into it? Okay, good. Yes, it's a massive. Well, I'm going to ask you actually. You tell me how you're using it.
Yeah, so it's a massive database of lots of technical stuff, and it can be customized. So we are adding a layer on top of it to customize to basically different roles and technology to make it very specific for the audience.
Okay.
Massively open online courses.
Massively open on. Yes.
Database, yeah.
What's interesting, this is again, I'm sure many of you may have seen this, but this is from the Josh Bursin blog from last year. And I think it's a great diagram just to show the evolution of where training has gone over the last 20 years. And it talks about the formats and users and systems. And, clearly from discussions I've had today and discussions over the last 6 months or so, more so, there are some commonalities. In the 2017 column there, obviously micro-learning is very much a thing, bite-sized chunks of data or learning that you want to deploy to learners. And that's clearly something which some of the current platforms have a challenge with. It needs to be balanced with more of the macro-learning, course-based program stuff as well. But clearly that's quite a critical thing. And going back to my point about the LMS becoming less relevant, I think the red box on the 2017 is starting to describe what it means. The LMS is still there, but it's more invisible. More and more now are we thinking about how the learner engages with that LMS, either from a targeted perspective or different communities might want to see it in different ways. And going back to the watershed that I mentioned earlier, people are now thinking about, well, the LMS is not the only place where we're capturing this data, and can we put some sort of broader analytics platform in place to actually start to assess what's really going on in the business through other sources. So I think that's great. That's, it's a great place to see. You get a lot of analysts and companies like ourselves saying this is the way things are going. But one thing I picked up on LinkedIn last week, I think it was. We did many of you probably went, the Learning Tech at Olympia, where there's a lot of people like me selling lots of things. And what was quite interesting was there was quite an interesting debate about the fact that certain visitors felt that it was very sales-driven, lots of buzzwords, lots of people with AI goggles and things like that, but actually maybe little in the way of connecting with the real world for certain companies. And this is Keith Marston from Topgolf, I think. And I think that the reality is that when you go on these webinars and you see this, you see that, and what people are doing, sometimes the reality is this is where you want to be, but actually getting there is quite a long path to get there. And I think I do share his view there that maybe I need to go back a little bit and explain some of the basics about what you can achieve with this type of stuff. So I'm going to cover, as I say, all the data component. I'm going to cover sort of two main areas today. I'm going to talk a bit about connecting, and I mean by connecting from a technology perspective, because I've talked about the idea of having an ecosystem and a collection of things that somehow connect together. And I'm going to talk about accessibility, and what I mean by that is the way learners can access the actual product and the platform. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about the correlation with performance. It's always, again, the challenge and the ideal and what's becoming more and more relevant now about how you measure how you take some sort of action based on the learning you're doing and change the business for the better. And sometimes that correlation isn't always apparent. I'll give you a few examples of how you could start thinking about that. So let's talk about Connect a little bit. One of the things, and this is really focusing on the LMS side of things, and again, it's focusing on the fact that if you were starting off again, you were considering the sort of LMS that you might want. These are some of the things, the whys, the things you might want to do with an LMS that you may not need now, but you might want to consider to engage your learner audience. So the first thing is, does the LMS enable you to have that personalization for the learning experience? So we work with companies who have a bunch of internal learners. Maybe some are more compliance focused and there's more mandatory training, and there's others where they want to understand what's possible in terms of the training and they want some recommendations and they want to discuss it with their manager on the manager side. So we've got different objectives in different parts of businesses, and some of the companies we work with have internal employee population and an external one. So we work with an automotive manufacturer who might do product training internally and share and deploy training in a certain way there, but they want to extend the platform to the distributors so that product training can be consumed by them as well, and it might be consumed in a slightly different way. It might be more bite-sized, it might be delivered in a sort of a bigger way to put more context around it. So making sure that the system that you choose can be deployed across different parties is one of the things. If you're able to sit there and think, what is it I would like, is the consideration. Each of those areas you might want to customize. You might want the ability to have the system to look differently for different populations. It obviously creates a uniqueness for that population. It makes them feel considered and part of something bigger, but specifically tailored for them. And think about the communication and collaboration. So making sure that if you are, I was talking to someone earlier about the fact that much of the training material from a corporate global perspective is sourced from the States. It's purchased, it's from the States, but it's consumed globally. But there's also local content also being deployed from a contextual perspective for the region. And it's making sure that you can have a platform which can not only track what's going on from the corporate world, but also you can embed your local content in as well. And the person that's receiving that content, no matter where it's coming from, you're able to track the distribution of it and where it is in terms of how it's being consumed. Mobile ready. I mean, people aren't yet we're not in a mobile ready world totally in terms of corporate, but the reality is that everything you want to consider, think about it on a device, any device. Can it be rendered correctly? Can it work? Can it work offline? Can it be downloaded, and can an exam be taken offline to be synced back up? And you would think some of this is actually quite obvious, but because different vendors are in different positions in their product roadmap, sometimes some of these things you might just expect to be there isn't necessarily there. So it's considering that concept as well and making it as easy as possible for that learner to engage with the content at any point during the working day or non-working day. And as I say, in a world of connections, and let's say your business ecosystem could be a series of connected businesses with your manufacturer, you have distributors, you have retail outlets. Think about the concept of being able to use an LMS to also create new revenue streams. Think about whether or not some of the training is corporate and in effect you fund it. Some of the training actually you want either managers to take accountability with their own budgets and have a shopping cart facility and get them to buy it. Makes you consider whether the training is right or not. Or whether you've got distributors or product sort of areas who should actually be paying for some of that and help funding it so you can pull that funding back into the centre and do more stuff. So it's making sure that the software enables you to do these things if you need it to happen. There are other reputable brands out there. I just picked these because there was a nice sort of shade of blue going on with all of these. But to be serious for a minute, the point with this slide is that considering an LMS, consider it from a perspective of, again, doing the job it should do. You know, consider it being something which, and this is my world, I guess, is platform neutral, something that can connect with other systems, because it's not about deciding whether the system just connects with an HR module or a talent management module, and therefore you might choose a learning module that fits that suite. But more and more now in an ecosystem environment, you might want to pull in, you might have a content management system, for example, you know, a Drupal sort of platform where you've got content. Well, why should you buy an LMS and port all that content into the LMS? You know, have an LMS where you can create your unique deep links, URLs, so that the system is a gateway to multiple data sources, and you can have a central global search for your multiple repositories, and you can pull in the data for consumption from other sources. What you're doing really is you're not therefore having to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. You've literally got something that sits in the middle and connects to other things. Workday is there in this example because you obviously need to connect with the HR data, the movers, the leavers, the joiners, that type of thing. We have companies that do have a concept of shopping cart, and they link things to Salesforce because they want their, in a world where they're delivering training content to end users as a service, a paid service, they want the Salesforce connection so their marketing and sales teams can understand what's going on and help with their account management and their new sales. And then, you know, social feeds like Twitter coming through on dashboards, and Watershed, which might be an analytics platform that can draw everything together. So think about an LMS with, in a technical sense, is what we call a set of open API connectors, interfaces where you can literally have a socket where you can plug in other things. It's a way to make sure you don't get pushed into a place where you've got perhaps a more substandard LMS module purely because your technical guys say it's the right thing and it needs to exactly fit the other modules that you've got, which are perhaps doing its job. So very often when we work with companies, we're faced with a situation where, and I'll just give an example, an SAP system had been purchased with a learning management module 5 years ago or something like that. And what's happened is over time is that the other modules have done their job, and the learning module really works from a procurement and from a technical perspective, but it's a horrendous user experience for the learners and the learning and development managers. So the idea that you put all your eggs in one basket doesn't always work when that vendor doesn't have the right functionality for you. So this is just a diagram to show how the connectors can still connect between an LMS and an HR system, but give you the deep functionality of the learning, but still give you the data flow between your different modules. So it's really the learning community, I guess, fighting for the reason to change, but the reason to change we find is because people come and say, yeah, it looks all right on paper and it sort of works, but actually our users are suffering, our learners are suffering. We need something better from a user experience perspective. It's not as difficult as you might think. You know, it sounds like a big undertaking to somehow put another system in place, but it's not always as difficult as that. If we talk about accessibility, so if we talk about how, I talked about how the user communities could link to the system. And I think that, again, some of these systems have such a broad remit on functionality, it's sometimes very hard to know where to start. So, you know, again, these are just really tips that may or may not be right for you at this time, but clearly what you want to do is you want to be able to put something in where you can literally roll it out and test that it's working, rather than polish and over-engineer something where people don't get something. You want to get those champions in the business that say this is great and it's growing, and you've got the stakeholders seeing some return on their investment. So again, the approach of having an LMS which is broad in functionality, but in a sense enables you to switch elements off and on, and having your own internal, I guess, roadmap of how you want to deploy it is really critical when you're starting to move forward with anything new like this. And these are steps, I guess, which just make it a little easier from a change management perspective. That's all right. By the way, I will supply the slides if you want after. Just let me know. Some of the other ways, I talked about communities seeing the system a little differently. We work with a life sciences company, 3Shape. They do 3D software and for scanners, dental equipment, that type of thing. And they developed an academy, 3Shape Academy, and they really wanted to focus a certain population of their people on a path through that academy. So if you think about what I'm showing you on that screen there, this is no more than having it's not very high tech, it's sort of a relatively low tech front end to an LMS, but gives a much richer feel to that person that, well, they're in an academy, it's all branded nicely, there's some steps there that they're going through, they can see the learning path, they can see where they're going next. Linked to that, they will have, as you can see, a tab that says Knowledge Centre. So they're able to see it. And perhaps this is also styled in exactly the way they've got their current intranet, for example. So again, making it easier for that user to associate what they're seeing with what they're used to seeing is a great way of thinking about it. Behind the scenes, going back to the invisible LMS, it's still there doing what it needs to do. It's tracking it, it's storing the data, you can report on it. But for the mass user, you might actually want something slightly differently. And then there's a couple of other examples like that. So that one focused on learning path. This is a retail organization, I guess more sales focused. So their focus on a front page doesn't suit all, but they've got a concept of leaderboards. So they're sort of showing which areas, I guess, have completed the training the quickest or to the best quality or what have you. So styling it around the culture is really important. When you buy a LMS product, there will be, like ours, there are options in the way you set out the front pages, but each of those is going to be quite different for different companies based on what they want. And then this is it's PepsiCo, this is a sales-focused LMS, and again, as you can see, they've got that sort of path concept. A getting started, which is probably an onboarding process for everyone, then more from a sales perspective, how you sell the PepsiCo way through to product training. And they might deploy some of that to their distributors as well in a slightly different form. So using data, measuring the impact. I'm conscious of time, a bit late here. I mentioned we work with Leo. Leo do their own research as well, so I thought I'd just share a bit of this with you because it's quite interesting. This is the second year of doing the same research, and they've seen some changes. Overall, everyone probably in this room, whatever, understands that they want to measure the business impact of learning programs. What's been interesting between last year and this year is there's been quite some significant change here that's worth noting. So we have we now have a better understanding, I guess, most L&D professionals, that it's possible to demonstrate there's an impact of learning. But what's more apparent is that the acknowledgement that the idea of co-joining sources and having a big data approach is the way to go is quite interesting. But the biggest pressure is the last one for the L&D professional, because what you see there is that the wider group, the stakeholders, the senior team, all know that stuff's out there, and now what they're doing is they're coming to you guys and saying, look, we want you to prove this if you want your money. So this is quite, a significant shift, I guess, in what people see across those 2 years. An LRS, as I said, I'm going to just move a little quicker, is around a data store system. It's a repository. It's a bunch of different pieces of data, in a sense, that are collected from different systems. But the difference being is that they're not necessarily in databases. They can be. We work with some companies who might have an incident report database and a LMS, and they're in two different systems, or a content management system and an LMS. But we're now talking about the ability to track emails, perhaps, documents, spreadsheets, other things that are going on in the organization, and being able to somehow pick up through something called XAPI, the ability to start interacting with those different things. The XAPI, just going back to basics, is what it says there. But what it really is, it's an activity and verb structure. It's like a set of rules. So what it really is, it's a layer of programming, I guess, and rule making, which, as you can see here, talks about how someone did that or someone does this. And the point is that you can set these rules, you can monitor the outputs, and then you can hone the inputs to make the outputs better. So as an example, from a measurement perspective, just take this example of a concept of deploying some piece of training and then doing your analysis of have the behaviours changed and then looking at the business impact. So an example of this might be you decide email, there's a lot of email going on in the business, there's too much email going on, too much activity, and you do a 30-minute e-learning module on how to do emails more efficiently or how you should send them. And then from that ability to ensure it's landed and looking at change of behaviour, you see there's been a 14% reduction in the traffic of email, and you've also seen a 3% increase in time saving from it. But let's say you could take that XAPI and you could work out that actually you could increase that a lot more because you've realised that what people are really doing is they're doing reply all a lot. They're just clicking reply all. And of course that's compounding the amount of time everyone's taking reading it and responding. By having that little bit of data, you could then deploy another piece of learning, or a memo or memorandum or a policy or whatever, which makes it clear as an organisation how you manage a reply to all. A very simple intervention, but actually could then significantly increase the time more and reduce traffic, even more. And it's trying to find those rules and to pinpoint where very small things can make a huge difference. Again, just from a layman's term perspective, because this is the sort of stuff that you'll hear someone like me at Learning Tech talk a lot about, and your head will get all, quite rightly, it all sounds the same after a while. There are 3 different types of LRS, so let me just briefly explain that. You've got the concept of having this XAPI within the LMS, so it only really reports on the LMS piece. You could have it over multiple data stores, so you could have someone tracking the email activity with the incident report log with the learning, but this middle section is really going into some big data repository, and you've got a team of technical people who need to work out the reports and then deliver them to the business. And then you've got the ideal, which is a learning analytics platform, which is the watershed example I mentioned earlier, which is where you have an LRS platform, which in effect takes all the data in, but also then presents you all the data through to the business. And it just collects that data. And as an ecosystem, what you can then do is you can decide which data sources you bring into that mix, and you decide which rules you have in there and what you hone. This is the last thing now. I wanted to just explain one more case study where we did this with a watershed analytics. We had AT&T. They had a lot of needs for compliance training, but they had a huge number of employees, many job titles, which actually varied the amount of variations in compliance training that they needed. And what they found, it was taking up too much time, too costly, and they really wanted to know, does that investment impact employee retention and performance? That was the only way they were going to do anything about it. So what they wanted to do is they wanted, as I described before, to get to a interaction sort of level detail of what was going on, who was accessing what, how quickly were they doing it, were they becoming compliant, were they passing the exams? And what we found was that, first of all, they had compliance training in one system, incident reporting in another, and they needed to bring the two together to sort of correlate some results, which they needed the XAPI linked from. And then, if they hadn't had that, they would have a lot of manual analysis to do, which is what they were doing. They were spending far too much time over-analysing, not getting the right results, and not doing anything about it. So they decided to put together and examine sort of a training investment versus most effective outcomes analysis. And they did some situational simulations randomly assigned to employees to sort of see how they would react to a different sort of quality of training, to see whether by improving the content, making it more visual, I guess more high fidelity than low, it was becoming more apparent that people were being able to complete things quicker. And they took the data from that, from the simulation, from the assessment, and from the results in those two systems. And they were able to then feed in the data, and from that, they were able to get dashboards on what was going on. And what was interesting was, what they found was that by tweaking a few things, they made significant result changes. So, for example, they worked out on certain courses, if they updated the course content for mobile deployment, people were accessing it more readily when they were offline. They're able to do it outside of the office rather than sitting in front of a computer. There was more uptake for it. they could streamline that experience. Also, they improved the quality. They probably had some video. They made it a bit more high quality and more visual rather than the written type documents that they had. And they increased the number of correct answers and therefore number of people that became compliant quicker, and also increased engagement. And then they also found that incorrect answers were in favour of a more conservative response, which meant that they indicated that the improved interactive simulation that they had encouraged sort of better employee ethics and not just compliance. So all in all, that example, I think, shows how a few tweaks perhaps can bring a huge amount of saving to the business. Now, it's not necessarily correlating directly to the revenue increase, but it is to the bottom line in terms of the resource saving on employees, on the number of hours spent in authoring content. So they're able to see real results in the business from that example. So that's a bit of a whirlwind on that, but I hope that gave you something to consider. Any questions at all at this point? No? We're over there. Net Dimensions, my colleague Alan is there, and Deborah. We have one thing I was going to offer is, and partly because our marketing team are super generous and always bring us loads of goodies, we've got these phone chargers, so feel free to quite blatantly come along and just say, I want a phone charger, I don't want to talk to you, just a phone charger, Stuart said, and you can go for it, okay? So,
Brilliant. Thank you very much,
you.
Stuart.
Thanks.